All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Criminal Legal System Initiative's second annual spring convening, Interrupting Cycles of Harm, Housing Strategies and Supports for Criminalized Survivors of Domestic Violence and Human Trafficking. We really appreciate you coming together today to talk about something this challenging, especially given the incredibly difficult, heartbreaking acts of violence we see playing out across the country every day that we already must grapple with. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today. My name is Bila Lindner, and I am a directing attorney with Homebase's Criminal Legal System Initiative. And today I am joined by my wonderful colleagues, Lily Harvey, Mihir Vora, Michelle Burns, and Nick Large, as well as our fantastic speakers who include housing providers, survivor services providers, public safety partners, advocates, and people with lived expertise. And of course, you all are here today. So please, if you haven't already, take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat, telling us your name and where you're from. And I just wanted to share a few fun facts about the people, the folks who registered for this convening. We have people from about 60 locations in California, 17 states plus Washington, DC, and people with expertise across many areas, including reentry work, homelessness prevention, housing, public health, policymaking, survivor services and advocacy, reproductive justice, youth homelessness, veteran services, behavioral health, violence prevention and public safety, law enforcement and corrections, juvenile justice systems, child welfare systems, legal services and public defense, disability rights advocates, data privacy experts, and people working in environmental justice. So the sheer breadth of interest in this convening reflects just how important this issue is, how much it cuts across so many systems and geographic areas, and how it highlights the importance of bringing together cross-sector partners and advocates to reflect on what we can all do to end cycles of harm for criminalized survivors of violence and human trafficking. Which brings me back to the critical question of why we are all here today. We are here because we know that access to safe, sustainable housing plays a critical role in healing and violence prevention for people who are harmed and for people who do harm. And that increasing access to housing can provide a powerful and effective alternative to those traditional responses to domestic violence and human trafficking, which can expose survivors to the criminal legal system and cause further harm. And so we hope that you leave here today feeling inspired and better equipped to take this issue on in your own communities in collaboration with cross-sector partners and centering survivors themselves. Next slide, please. So some logistics for the day before we get started. Closed captioning is available, and you can access it by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. Everyone is on mute so that we can limit ambient noise, but we encourage you, highly encourage you to use the chat to ask questions and share your thoughts throughout the convening. This is so much about what you have to offer and your expertise that you bring today. So we really hope for robust involvement of everyone here. We are recording this event, and we will make the recording and all slides available to folks after the convening. And if you run into any tech issues, please go ahead and send a message to my colleague, Nick Large, and he'll help you out. Next slide, please. A bit about Homebase, for those of you who are unfamiliar with us. Homebase is a nonprofit organization that works with communities, continuums of care, and homelessness service providers across the country to build local capacity to end homelessness. And on the next slide, you'll learn a little bit more about Homebase's Criminal Legal System Initiative, which provides specialized technical assistance and training on issues at the intersection of homelessness, housing instability, and the criminal legal system. Turning now to our agenda. First, we are going to hear from our amazing opening speaker, Andrea Diaz. Then we will hear from panel 1, which is going to focus on how access to safe, stable housing, or the lack thereof, plays a pivotal role in the lives of criminalized survivors. Then we're going to take a quick break and then resume with panel 2, which will focus on how housing providers and public safety systems can work together to prevent survivor criminalization by offering alternatives to traditional responses to violence. And lastly, we will have a brief closing activity before we end for the day. And because we want to make this event a positive experience for everyone involved, we're going to make some commitments for the day. We're going to make sure that we respect thoughts and opinions, even when they are different from our own. We will engage with good intentions and trust that others will too. We will work together to ensure that the event stays on track and on time. And we will be thoughtful around language choices. So for example, trying to use person first language, limiting the use of acronyms, etc. And lastly, we want to remind everyone that this convening covers sensitive issues that may trigger attendees or otherwise cause emotional distress. So we highly encourage you to take care of yourself as necessary during this event and throughout the day. Please take breaks and go off camera whenever you need to. And remember, this event is being recorded, and we also are going to make slides available, so you don't need to worry about missing anything. And if you would like to make a comment or ask a question anonymously, you can always send a direct message to one of our facilitators who can share it out for you. Or let us know if you want to keep it just with us, and that's also fine as well. All right. So with those logistics out of the way, we're going to do a quick grounding activity to help focus our attention in the here and now so that we can really be present with each other. So I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead and sit in a comfortable place if you're not already, hopefully you are, with your feet planted firmly on the ground. And first, I want you to find 5 things that you can see. And you can say them out loud to yourself, you can write them down, or just say them in your head. So for example, I see my computer, I see a tree outside. So just 5 things that you can see. And next, I'd like you to find 4 things that you can feel. For example, I feel my feet cold against the floor. I feel that my hands are a little bit sweaty because I'm a little bit nervous. Maybe that's TMI, so on and so forth. So find 4 things that you can feel. Now find 3 things that you can hear. Listen for any sounds. It could be the sounds of traffic outside or the sound of your own breathing. And now 2 things that you can smell. You can stand up and move to another spot to smell something, or if you can't smell anything at the moment, just think of some smells that bring up memories for you. And finally, say 1 thing that you can taste. It can be the toothpaste from brushing your teeth or your morning coffee. And if you can't taste anything, you can think about your favorite taste. All right, now take a deep breath and arrive here all together. Thank you. All right, so now I am very, very honored to introduce our opening speaker, Andrea Diaz from MISSY. Andrea is the Training Institute Manager for MISSY, an Oakland-based organization that provides support to commercially sexually exploited youth and works for systemic change with the youth they serve through direct service, awareness, education, and advocacy. Thank you so much for joining us. Andrea, take it away.
Thank you so much for inviting us into this space and giving us some opportunity to share a little bit about our work and just give some grounding to this. So hello, my name is Andrea. I work for MISSY, and we can go to the next slide. A little bit about MISSY. We have been around for 15 years. This is actually our 15-year anniversary. So we're really excited to be part of the community and have been able to be here for as long serving young people. When we first started, we were primarily supporting young people that were in crisis. And since then, our services have shifted for more ongoing care. Since we know that supporting somebody in crisis is only the beginning, there's a whole journey after that to really get them to a space where they can explore and start thriving. We could go to the next slide. Some of our direct services include case management. So we have intensive case management with the young people who decide that that's what they're ready for. We have a drop-in center that serves, again, more of that immediate needs. We usually try to provide food, hygiene kits. During COVID, it was also a lot of PPE and making sure that young people had all that access. And then it's also just a place to come in, you know, if they need somewhere to go, oftentimes young people don't have somewhere to go. So they were able to come in to just hang out, sit down, you know, browse through a computer, whatever it is that they needed and wanted. We have youth engagement specialist in the Alameda County foster care site and the assessment center. Young people who are impacted by the foster care system have a very high, are at very high risk of being exploited. So that's kind of a preventative measure for us. We want to be there so we can start building that rapport and make sure that if young people do find themselves in a situation in which exploitation is coming up where they're being recruited, they already have some connection to somebody in the community so they can seek support. And then leadership and advocacy. We were started by survivors, and we continue to really try to make sure that survivor voice is still what informs all our programming, our policy, so that we aren't serving from a place of disconnect, and so that what we believe we're providing is actually having the impact that we are hoping to have. Next slide. The other part of our work is trying to impact systemic change. So having opportunities like this to talk to individuals who engage with young people, community outreach, public policy and legislation, as well as prevention, right? If we can get in front of it and inform young people with the tools and information they need to not get involved in exploitation, to not be exploited, then we're really getting ahead of it all. But we definitely know that, you know, we want to make sure that we're not placing the onus on those that are being impacted, and that we really hold that, you know, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. And so how are we making sure that policy, legislation, as well as other community serving organizations are also serving young people in the ways that they need to be served, and those impacted by exploitation and trafficking in the ways that they need to be served. And then the next slide. And I think those are my slides. Yes. And then a little bit about me. I have been doing gender-based violence work for about a decade now. Prior to that, I was working with young people in Los Angeles on Skid Row. And I was working in an after-school program. Coming to Missy has really allowed me to bring both of those pieces together, working with young people and also supporting against gender-based violence and doing the advocacy work. I did a lot of direct work when I first started this, and have since shifted into what I now think of more of an advocate role, and getting to be in spaces and rooms, really bringing forth education and conversations that hopefully will support in shifting the lens of how we are viewing these issues overall. I really appreciate y'all being here today and doing the work to, you know, break these cycles and really impact how we are also sometimes part of those harmful cycles of violence. As you all come together and as you go through the different workshops and have those different conversations, I really want to encourage you all to think about how you can take all that knowledge, all that talk that happens, and start thinking of action steps, right? Because where the change really happens isn't in these spaces, right? This is where sometimes those lens shifts, those aha moments, those, I had never thought of it that way, or that stretch and pull of how we're holding some of these issues happen. But then we got to go out there and do it. And it's often in the places where it's the hardest, where people aren't willing to shift the lens, where policies have been in place and getting them to change is really difficult. So really digging in and thinking of how we're going to take our time here today and then move on with it when we leave and back into the systems and institutions we're a part of and impact some change. So as we're doing that, also invite you to explore your relationship with the word harm. It is used a lot, and it's sometimes really easy for us to other it. But the truth is that we all inflict harm, whether on purpose or on accident. We have all been harmed and have harmed others. And so what judgments and what biases come up when we hear that word? And how does that impact how we serve others? So taking that time to introspect and make sure that we are aware of what's coming up for us, and then how we navigate through that so that we aren't having harmful and negative impacts on others. And then also, how do you navigate that for yourself? How do you offer yourself grace and forgiveness when you do inflict harm, when we are sometimes, in these situations? Because often the way that we offer it ourselves is how we're willing to offer it to others. So I also invite you to explore that as we continue to have these conversations and as you all continue to talk in the various rooms. But as I mentioned earlier, these issues do not happen in a vacuum. Like many issues in our country, they are a result of oppressive systems, social inequalities, and biased and discriminatory practices. We need to look at the conditions and do the work to impact the result. Everything from policy and procedure to our own beliefs and judgments. We all have varying degrees of power that allow us to affect this change. We need to shift the preconceived ideas of what a victim, a survivor, and harm mean, and what they should look like and how they should present. And how these ideas then bleed over into our policies and our practices. And they dictate who has access to support and safety, and who is worthy of our resources. When we do this, we are often replicating the cycles of violence that deny people the right to safety and resources, and are often just asking people to replace one abuse for the other. We have to make sure that we're creating space for people's full human experience, to ensure that access to resources isn't based on a biased perspective that is often built around the idea of the perfect victim. This involves us shifting our lens by becoming more informed on the topics, listening to those who are impacted. And then we can align our practices and advocate for change in the systems we are engaged in. A change that doesn't deny safe housing opportunities to individuals who are impacted by systems and then forced to choose between situations of harm. Not having access to housing, to food, as well as other basic needs is no less harmful than other forms of violence. And when we deny people their access to safe housing as a result of policies that expect people to deny their own rich experience and current realities, we're often, again, repeating those cycles of harm that they are already engaged in, those cycles of violence that they're already find themselves in. Housing should not be a prize that people get after they've checked off all our boxes. Boxes that are often, created by systems that weren't often meant to serve them. Housing should be part of the foundation of support that is offered to people so they can move into safe and stable situations and really support them on their healing journey. For those of us who are impacted by violence, whether violence in home, sexual violence, violence from relationships, or community violence, we know that we are more than those experiences of violence. And while those experiences can have lasting impacts and can inform the way we sometimes show up in the world. They do not at all dictate who we are as a whole. And when we're using person-first language, it really honors that. It honors the fullness of a person. And it reminds us that this is an experience, and to really look and open up to that whole person, so that when we're offering support to that whole individual, not just based on the one experience that they had. As we're doing that work and as we're inviting in people's authenticity and fullness, it really can support in changing these harmful narratives, and invite us to center that individual. Because yes, we need to do the work and we need to do a lot of the advocacy and that pushing, but in that, we want to make sure that we're never forgetting to center that individual who we are serving. Because when we shift that focus into what we are doing and how we're doing it, we again start getting into that power piece of I know better and I'm gonna do. And often into a savior mentality, right? And people don't need saving. People are very capable. People are able, when given the resources and tools, to support and navigate for themselves. So how do we make sure that we center and create the conditions for people to thrive? So as I close out and give some space for the upcoming workshops, again, I ask that you don't leave your thoughts here, but really create some action plans on how you're going to implement some of this and actually change. And maybe it's internal, right? Maybe it's that self-analysis of where my biases show up, because we all have biases, right? And I do want to name that being biased is not a bad thing. It's actually one of the things that has kept us alive as humans, right? You pet the little cat, you don't pet the big tiger. That's a bias, but that keeps us safe. But where are those coming up? In ways that we're harming others rather than keeping ourselves safe. And so we just have to make sure we're doing that work. And then where do you hold your power? Where is your power and what systems are you engaged in that you can go in and impact, right? That you can go in and actually advocate for policy, procedure changes, whether it's in, because we often say systems are harmful, but we're often a part of those systems now. And how are we taking that responsibility as part of those systems, as part of that society? So really thinking of how we can move forward in action. And I think just to close this out, I think not forgetting that we want to make sure we're supporting people and meeting their basic needs and safety, but we also want to support people in finding their joy, right? And in all this and being safe and stable, it's also about being able to have a full human experience. And part of that is also being able to find moments of joy and celebration and happiness. So how do we also bring that into these spaces? And as we leave out, just reminding you in these difficult and hard conversations, if you all can share what makes you laugh, what brings you joy, and you all can share that out in the chat. And I think that's also a great way to get to know who else is in the room. So I appreciate you all, and I am going to probably stick around for a couple workshops, so at least the next one. So I hope to see you all and then have some growing discussions. What brings you joy, or what makes you laugh? And if anybody wants to, I think, share out loud, I think you're allowed to as well. But chat usually makes it easier. Watching
what brings me joy and what makes me happy?
Yes.
My dog. Her name is Homegirl, and she makes me very happy. She's sitting next to me right now.
Share out a couple things. People are saying floral design, music, poetry, grandbabies, music, TikTok, family. Board games. Yes, I love board games. Travel. Thank you all for sharing. Nature. Me too. I like nature as well. And pets. And as I leave and I do that, just remembering, right, that these are the things that bring us joy. These are the things that are important to us. So how do we consider them when we're also bringing support and service? So when we're offering housing that has a lot of limitations, that doesn't allow people to bring pets, that doesn't allow people to engage in certain activities that are core to our happiness, how does that also not honor individuals' humanity? Right. So how are we also keeping that in mind in our service provision and when we're supporting others? That all this is as critical and as important as having the shelter, right? It's also the creating of the home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. We really appreciate your words and your presence here today. So thank you again for joining us. Now I would like to pass it off to Mahir and our first panelists.
Great, thanks so much, Viola. Yeah, if we could. Great, thanks everyone. So our first panel today is called Housing's Role in Cycles of Harm. And you can go on to the next slide. So what we're going to talk about today in terms of goals for this panel, including the speakers and then the following Q&A, are to one, learn how housing can make the difference for criminalized survivors. Two, see how providing access to housing can be a safe alternative to incarceration. And three, understand ways housing can disrupt cycles of harm. Great, next slide. And today we'll be hearing from three speakers. First, we'll hear from Kate Walls at the National Housing Law Project. Then Melanie Thompson from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. And finally, from Solomon Middleton Williams at the Newark Community Street Team. And with that, we'll start with Kate.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me today. I'm going to talk about the impact of housing policies on the lives of survivors of violence who've been criminalized. Next slide, please. So there's a key unfortunate connection between gender-based violence and an increased risk of homelessness. And there are a number of barriers to safety that make it very difficult to maintain stable housing. So it was a direct result of the power and control dynamics related to their abuse. Survivors often face unique barriers to access shelter and affordable housing. Their credit and rental histories are ruined as a direct result of the abuser running up credit card bills, lying about paying rent, not allowing the survivor to pay rent, not paying utilities, not covering other bills such as childcare or other costs. This affects the survivor's ability to pass a landlord background check. It also puts them at great risk of eviction if the rent is not being paid. And abusers know that, and so they'll use that as part of that to make the survivor more vulnerable. They also often experience a lack of steady employment, and that can be caused when they're forced to miss work as a result of the violence, or they're fired as a result of stalking or other harassing behavior of the perpetrator. They often face housing discrimination. This typically can occur when a landlord will evict a victim from their housing due to repeated calls to the police or to property damage caused by the abuser or by the abuser violating trespass orders and continually entering the property. If you can mute, I have got some feedback on my side. Thank you. And then there's also a risk if they're able to secure subsidized or affordable housing. Thank you, I appreciate that. If they're able to secure subsidized or other affordable housing, they're often at risk of losing that housing for similar reasons as to private landlords. That the housing provider may see that actions that were actually committed by the abuser, they hold the survivor accountable for. It should be that because of the housing provisions of the Violence Against Women Act, survivors should not be at risk of losing their federally subsidized housing. However, I'm here to tell you that they still often are, and that is frequently because housing providers fail to understand and appreciate the full dynamics of abuse, and they're holding survivors accountable for the perpetrator's actions. Next slide, please. One of the most problematic local initiatives impacting survivors of violence, in particular criminalized survivors, is crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances. These are programs or ordinances initiated by a municipality, and they have distinct but common features. First, the crime-free programs typically require a property owner to execute a crime-free lease addendum with their tenants. So the local government will tell the property owner that they must do it as a condition of leasing property in their community, or they'll strongly encourage a property owner to do it, and the property owner will perceive that they don't in fact have a choice. Most of these crime-free lease addendums also require a mandatory criminal background check of all adult tenants and applicants. Sometimes it even includes minor children. There are frequently mandatory landlord trainings about how they're supposed to enforce and execute the crime-free lease addendum. And again, while participation might be stated as mandatory or voluntary, in speaking with property owners around the country, they typically find, even in those jurisdictions that are voluntary, landlords feel this pressure that if they don't participate in the program, they will be considered not being a good member of the community. The crime-free lease addendum typically has a component that if there's any criminal activity at the property, everyone within the household must be evicted, regardless of whether or not they're an innocent third party, if they're actually the crime victim, if the criminal activity did not result in an arrest or conviction. Then there are nuisance property ordinances. These take on sort of a life of their own in terms of the municipality adopting what's considered to be a very broad definition of nuisance conduct, everything from trash in the yard to a first-degree murder. Allegations of nuisance behavior obligate the landlord, similar to the crime-free programs, to abate the nuisance, which really means to evict the entire household. And again, not distinguishing between who is a crime victim, if there was a conviction or not, or who was an innocent third party. There are potential fines, fees, even condemnation orders or loss of rental property license if the landlord doesn't comply and abate the nuisance. Next slide, please. The origin of these programs and ordinances, the crime-free programs are a law enforcement-based crime prevention solution started in 1992 by a police officer at the Mesa, Arizona Police Department. The International Crime-Free Institute reports now that more than 3,000 local jurisdictions participate in its programming. Next slide, please. So as I noted, there's a broad definition of criminal activity under both the crime-free program and nuisance ordinance. So activities can be defined as garbage on the property, to an arrest, whether or not it results in a conviction, to even just using calls to the police as the basis or trigger for saying a person may be in violation of the crime-free program or nuisance ordinance. For nuisance ordinances in particular, you will see where they say 3 calls to the police within a certain period of time, or 3 acts within a certain period of time, which again are often tied to the number of calls to the police. And one jurisdiction where I've been involved in some litigation over their nuisance ordinance, it was 3 calls to the police within a 365-day window. As you can imagine, then, these types of policies have a disproportionate impact on survivors of violence, but they can also be used to target immigrants in a community that may not be welcomed, people of color, and lead ultimately to increased housing insecurity in the community. Next slide, please. Survivors of domestic violence facing these ordinances and programs often must make a choice between seeking safety away from their abusers or remaining housed. They are being dissuaded from contacting law enforcement, especially in these jurisdictions, looking at the number of calls. And neighbors are often calling the police on their behalf as a measure to support them, or because they don't understand what's happening within the home, and then unknowingly triggering the ordinance. If we understand the dynamics of abuse, then we know that a survivor cannot control a perpetrator's access to the home. They may be allowing a perpetrator in the home because they're trying to mitigate and reduce the abuse against them or others, and they don't feel that they have any other choice that is safe to them. Perpetrators are often aware of these crime-free programs and nuisance ordinances and will use it to criminalize or silence a survivor. I'll give you one example. In the case of Lakeisha Briggs versus Norristown, Pennsylvania, Miss Briggs was told by her landlord and police within Norristown that if she continued to call the police for assistance, she was a victim of domestic violence, she would be evicted and she would lose her Section 8 voucher. She was so afraid of losing her housing and her housing assistance that she stopped calling the police, and she told her relatives and neighbors, no matter what, do not call the police. The perpetrator knew that she was facing this threat of losing her home and her Section 8 voucher, and he used that as an opportunity to further harm her. She was stabbed by the perpetrator. She had to be life flighted away from her home to a hospital. The neighbors, hearing her screams, called the police. And sure enough, she was issued an eviction notice for having too many calls to the police. So this is sort of the perfect weapon for a perpetrator to further abuse and silence a survivor. Next slide, please. So these programs and ordinances really reinforce messaging and isolation for survivors of abuse. They reduce the type of community-wide support that's needed and public safety that's needed to support survivors. It really means that they'll have a lack of faith in the criminal justice response to holding abusers accountable. It increases their risk of homelessness, which has a significant impact not only on them, but others, including children, where they may fear that if they don't have a home or stable home, they may lose their children. Evictions, like I said, are quite common as a result of these crime-free programs and nuisance ordinances. And as we know from the research, eviction records, even just the eviction filing itself, and not just the judgment, have long-term impacts on a person's ability to secure safe and affordable housing in the future. These ordinances and programs also really flip long-standing education efforts that domestic violence and sexual assault advocates have done with law enforcement to really see and center survivor needs when they're being contacted for assistance. So what we've often seen now is police stop actually seeing the gender-based violence and start focusing instead on the crime and investigating if there's a crime. So what's often happening then too is that survivors are arrested for the noise violation or for the criminal damage to property violation. And in interviewing police who've enforced these programs and ordinances, they start using terms like, well, she's not a true victim of domestic violence. There were other things going on that normally police understood to be actually part of the cycle of abuse. But because they've been tasked with enforcing these programs and ordinances, they start to really separate out other related harms and start only seeing very few people as true victims of domestic violence. Next slide, please. It's also critical to understand the defining role of race and racism in the promulgation of these crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances. They give police unchecked discretion to reinforce racial boundaries and target Black and Brown communities for eviction and displacement. They permit white neighbors to directly control the behavior of their Black and Brown neighbors by threatening their housing stability should they not be behaving in ways considered acceptable by their white neighbors. They use their power to repeatedly call the police to target their Black and Brown neighbors. So in investigations that I've done, I've seen it where Black families are called, people are calling the police on them because they have a birthday party in their backyard because Black boys are playing basketball in the street, or they're out past curfew playing a baseball game. This discriminatory policing flourishes because the threshold for nuisance is so low. As I noted before, just a few calls to the police over even a year period, even if they don't result in an arrest, charge, or conviction, and they can result in that person or household being labeled a nuisance. In some communities, if and once you are labeled a nuisance, it even interferes with your ability to lease rental property at all in the community going forward. And it results in these families being destabilized. It also in particular impacts survivors of color who are more likely to be criminalized and not seen as victims and to be evicted and not offered assistance. Next slide, please. There is serious legal liability for local governments that have and enforce these crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances. There are First Amendment violations because it interferes with the right to call the police for emergency assistance, which is called the right to petition the government. There are 14th Amendment violations under the Due Process Clause and Equal Protection Clause. There may be Fourth Amendment violations if police are determining if a person can be a tenant within a rental property in their community. There are serious Federal Fair Housing Act violations for race, national origin, and sex discrimination. There are true conflicts with the Violence Against Women Act, which protects applicants and tenants in the federally subsidized housing programs from being evicted or denied admission due to their status as victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking. And there are a number of state laws that restrict or preempt local programs and ordinances. Next slide, please. HUD has responded, and we hope to see more out of HUD in short order. in trying to limit the use of crime-free programs and nuisance ordinances around the country. First, in 2016, HUD issued guidance under the Federal Fair Housing Act, talking about the enforcement of these nuisance ordinances and crime-free programs against victims of domestic violence and other victims and others who require police or emergency services. HUD made the connection between using these laws or programs either intentionally or unintentionally in a way that is harmful to survivors of violence and how that can constitute sex discrimination. HUD also talked about and reminded localities that they also have guidance about criminal records screening and that jurisdictions must consider that criminal record screening guidance, which ties race discrimination to the use of criminal record screening, that they must consider that guidance as well as they enforce or roll out any nuisance ordinance or crime-free program. We anticipate within the next year, HUD will update the 2016 guidance to include a deeper discussion of the role of race with respect to crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances and disability. HUD has also engaged in a series of what we call compliance reviews. These are for localities that receive federal housing dollars, such as home funds or CDBG funds. Hemet, California, recently underwent a compliance review under Title VI and was required to repeal their crime-free program and nuisance property ordinance and set up a monetary relief fund for landlords and tenants who had been harmed by those programs and ordinances. They are not allowed to initiate a new program or ordinance without HUD's permission. There was also a secretary-initiated complaint under Title VI and the Federal Fair Housing Act against Norristown, Pennsylvania. This is the case I mentioned previously with Lakeisha Briggs. And currently, pending in federal court, the Department of Justice has brought a case against Hesperica, California for its crime-free program. Next slide, please. There are a number of jurisdictions that have laws to curb or limit crime-free programs and nuisance ordinances. I'll just briefly note California's program prohibits localities from interfering with a person's right to call the police for assistance or seek other emergency assistance, and protects both landlords and tenants. There's also a provision protecting tenants from the landlords imposing any rental conditions or terms in a lease regarding their right to call the police for assistance. Next slide, please. Here's my contact information. I'm happy to answer any further questions you may have either today or by email. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. I'll remind everyone that after our three panelists all present, we have time for a question and answer section. So if any questions come to you, feel free to put them in the chat, and Homebase staff is keeping track of them, and we'll ask them to our panelists. So our next panelist is Melanie Thompson from the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. Melanie, go ahead.
Thank you, Mahir. Also, thank you for all of you being here. Thank you, Bila. Thank you, Kate, for all of that amazing information. I am not going to present a PowerPoint. I find that this discussion is super important to have, and I would say face-to-face, but as face-to-face as virtual gatherings can get. So again, my name is Melanie Thompson. I am the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, which is an international organization that works and seeks on the legal and policy side of trying to reduce trafficking in our countries and globally. However, I also bring to you a lot of lived experience. I am somebody who grew up in a domestic violence household as the oldest of 10 children. My father was very abusive to my mother and struggled with a lot of substance abuse issues. I myself am a survivor of human trafficking and prostitution domestically. So I bring to you that experience. I've also been in a domestic violence relationship myself. In addition to that, I have had experience with the criminalized system. I'm a native New Yorker, but I have been all over the 50 states. And I bring to you that perspective of somebody who's gone through both juvenile detention and adult criminalization, human trafficking intervention courts, and the foster care system. So before I get into some of my notes here, I just want to preface by saying that I might be using, or you might hear me say the term reoffender in this case. That's all for a lack of better term. And I want to highlight that language is super, super important when we're talking about these populations. And I do think the term reoffender is very stigmatizing. So when I'm getting into some of my thoughts on how housing can really be the difference for criminalized survivors of these different crimes and abuses, I do think that one of the first ways that housing can help to make a step in the right direction, if you will, is to tweak some of the language on how they approach survivors in their policies and systems. So you'll often see me put reoffenders in quotes. But overall, why is it important for us to invest in these communities? And this is all across the spectrum, right? So first, there's a sense of urgency that we as a community and as a society should really focus when it comes to these populations. Oftentimes, survivors of trafficking, survivors of DV, intimate partner violence, sexual assault, usually have a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Their situations are usually more urgent than somebody who just wants to get an apartment within the next 3 years or so. Oftentimes, many of their situations call for some type of emergency placement or some type of emergency movement. And really, just overall, we need to continue to, if not, we need to prioritize survivors of these situations and backgrounds and getting them into stable housing. And I think that's the first step overall. In situations where emergency housing or placements are not available, there is this potential to reoffend. Oftentimes, many survivors of trafficking go back to their exploiters and their traffickers because they have no place to stay. Relapse is overall super prevalent within the sex trade and within human trafficking. But oftentimes when we do not have a place of our own to live, to house our children, to focus on work or any of those types of things, and we have no other resources, as many trafficking survivors specifically don't, we often go back to the person who was exploiting us or abusing us because they often bring to us a sense in the most wayward ways of stability. And we want to reduce the amount, if not eradicate completely, the way that we rely on the people that are abusing us. But if we don't have a home and these people that are beating us or hurting us or forcing us to do things are offering us a bed, oftentimes when we weigh out the two negatives, we end up relapsing. So housing is super important when it comes to trying to reduce the amount of times that we relapse. A lot of us also have children, whether that's the survivors of trafficking, DV survivors, folks who are affected by intimate partner violence. And if for us, that poses a very immediate need. If not for ourselves, for our children, we need them to have a place to stay. Oftentimes, a lot of survivors of domestic violence, most of the time when they have children, in effort to get them away from their abuser, they would want to enroll them in school, some type of after school program, things of that nature, many of which you cannot enroll your children into without a stable address. So it is super important to have some type of housing stability in that arena. There are so many different ways that housing can or has made the difference. Again, going back to this, emphasizing the need of immediate safe shelter from their situations. And that can look like either me, say, as a survivor, getting my apartment immediately, or that can look like emergency safe shelters. Now, across the 50 states, we see a lack of shelters and beds. And it's unfortunate that the need is just so high. So we are always going to be in a deficit of the beds that we have, but it is super important to recognize that we should improve some of the programs that we have surrounding this, try to find more funding for beds. I know that funding is stretched out, if you will, amongst so many different programs. But it's there, and we need to find a way to make this a priority so that more beds are available for survivors of all of these different things, so that beds are available for their children, and that the policies that are in place to vet these individual situations changes, so that we place the immediate need on getting them safe first, and then kind of backtracking and figuring out what exactly the situation was. Additionally, housing provides not only the stability physically, but a sense of self-worth. And I think that this is something that's not talked about enough in the conversation. When we think about our basic needs, we think about food, we think about water, we think about shelter. And oftentimes, many of these survivors of intimate partner violence, trafficking, DV, majority of us, if not all, struggle with some type of mental illness that they either had going in to their DV, intimate partner violence, trafficking situation, or that they developed because of it. And the most common among them include critical depression, PTSD or complex PTSD. And then for many folks, there are folks that have high functioning disabilities or disabilities in general that are left out of this conversation. And for us, for many people who suffer with chronic depression, who have children that may be impacted by that depression, we often slip into negative self-thoughts or self-talk, not having the resources in place to seek therapy, things of that nature, and not having a place to live can contribute to that downward spiral. So oftentimes, I know, and I'm speaking from experience here, I know that there was a time when I was homeless and coming out of my trafficking situation, or attempting to at the time, me not having a place to live made me feel like more of a failure. Now, on the surface, that's just a negative self-thought. But when you contribute that and add that in addition to my already diagnosed chronic depression and PTSD, now I'm at risk for either self-harm, harming something else or someone else in the community, or doing something out of desperation or necessity to feel better and appease my mental health issues. But because I don't have the resources or a place to live to focus on those things, I can be considered a reoffender or even more detrimental than when I was going into the situation. So I think it's super important to also emphasize, outside of the physical logistics of housing, and why it's important to also recognize how internally having a place to live can increase self-esteem and self-worth. Having a place to live not only stabilizes the person and their situation, but it can prevent additional crimes and homelessness and violence due to homelessness. So this is not the case for everybody, but there are a lot of survivors who become criminalized because they have no other resources or options. When many folks become homeless, it usually starts, there are different cycles for everybody depending on their situation. However, it could look like homelessness where you are couch surfing and hopping from family member to family member, friend to friend's couch. And then there are other times where it could look like you sleeping on a park bench, or you and your kids seeking shelter under a tree or somewhere shady. And oftentimes in those more extreme situations, you are lacking resources to not only sleep, but to food. What we find, especially here in New York City, is that there are a lot of individuals who end up in those extreme sides of homelessness. And the violence and the crimes that are associated with that looks like stealing, that looks like fighting other folks for territory. If somebody came and said, this is my park bench, and then another homeless person says, this is my park bench, that can be that can turn very violent very quickly. And oftentimes we are criminalized, those folks are criminalized because of the fighting aspect, but we're not addressing why it is that they're fighting, and that underlying cause of homelessness being the contributing factor to getting into these public nuisance calls or these disruption to the community offenses and charges that later on lead to more extensive criminal records. So it's extremely important to recognize that. And again, this can go back to preventing re-engagement with exploiters. Now, in those situations on the street, but also in other situations, I can be couch surfing from friend to friend and feel like I'm a bother to the person that I am couch surfing on. So I will call my exploiter, or I will call my ex-husband, or I will call my wife, whoever's abusing me, and say, I really just need to come back home because I can no longer stay where I'm at. Or, there's oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot, it's a lot more common than we talk about. Oftentimes, folks who get into an immediate homeless situations, when they call a friend or a family member, the friend or family member is extremely supportive. And this is usually after they've exhausted their state or city's local homeless shelters or systems. When that's not an option, they find that their friends and family members are extremely supportive of them in the beginning. And they say, take as long as you need, stay as long as you like. But after a week, even without saying it, you start to feel uncomfortable because people are starting to give you a side eye. You don't have any money to contribute to the groceries. In the case of my mother, we were homeless before my trafficking experience, before I was on my own. It was myself, my 6 siblings at the time, my mother, and we stayed at an aunt's house. And our aunt was extremely supportive, but my aunt was somebody who was living in affordable housing. So not only is there a side eye, if you will, because we cannot contribute to the groceries, the rent, or we're taking up too much space or whatever have you. But then there's also this dual component, if you will, of the person that we are seeking immediate refuge or shelter from having to answer to their own policies. Oftentimes in affordable housing, it is not allowed for you to have anybody else stay with you that's not on your lease. That not only puts her or the other person you're staying with at face of eviction, but you also have to deal with any other criminal penalties that may come from harboring somebody that's not attached to your lease. So it's a cycle that continues all the way down the line. It doesn't even just end with the person that's immediately in that DV situation. And having housing or any type of stable shelter gives you the ability to focus not only on rebuilding your life after leaving an abuser, or rebuilding your children's lives after their leaving of the abuser, but it also gives you the ability to focus on getting even more permanent housing. Oftentimes, and this becomes a little bit of a problem later on, when you are in emergency housing, depending on it could be protected under VAWA or not, but depending on the situation, some emergency housing placements will require that within 30 days you are finding work, or depending on where you are, there are different rules for different shelters, but some will say you can stay here as long as you like and you're protected under this law. But then in other cases, they'll say you need to have a job in order to stay here. You're allowed to sleep here for the night, but between the hours of 9 and 6, you need to be outside doing something productive or conducive, and you need to show proof of that. And that can become really difficult, and that can lead to the person not having the resources or the things that they need to prove that. And it leads to, again, that lack of instability, going back to the streets, going back to homelessness, going back to their abusers. So, I'll talk a little bit later about the things that we can do to prevent that on a systemic level, but these are really important to note because a lot of times we'll say, we have housing, we have shelters in these states, or there are programs available, but then if you're requiring something of the person that's seeking refuge there, something that they can't attain, they can't get a job, or maybe they were in a situation where their abuser was the one that was the breadwinner or holding everything down, it is extremely difficult to require somebody that is fleeing their domestic violence or trafficking situation to then expect them within the next 14 to 30 days to have a job to be able to prove that they can sleep in the bed that they're being provided with. So housing can absolutely serve as an alternative to incarceration if approached in the right way. Again, it can prevent re-exploitation. It can prevent the crimes associated with re-exploitation and homelessness, not going back to your abusers, not having to fight somebody on the street for a place to sleep, not stealing things, basic necessities, food, blankets, pillows. These are things that we see very, very often here in New York City. It provides the housing stability, but it also gives opportunity to focus on other subsidies and benefits. So in many of the states, there are benefits, if you will, I'll put benefits in quotes as well. There are benefits to being in low income or affordable housing or an emergency shelter. So often there are some public benefits or resources that are more readily available to those who are in those populations. Here in New York, they'll say you are eligible for a free MetroCard, which is our method of transportations, bus pass, train pass, if you will, you are eligible for a free Metro card if you are on public assistance. Sometimes in these arenas, food stamps, SNAP, TANF, things like that, you have to already be in some type of emergency shelter, low income housing to be eligible to get food stamps. In other states, it's not the case, but in this state and in many others, you have to already be, and the cycle is astounding to me, but you already have to be poor and you have to be coming out of an abusive situation and be relying on one public welfare benefit in order to receive the other. So housing can play a role here if there is a way to provide stable housing, take a family that's fleeing a DV situation, put them, say, in the projects and affordable housing and low-income housing, and then say, by living in this apartment, we can now help you apply for you and your children's food stamp application, Medicaid application, things of that nature. Now, in other places and in other circumstances, you can apply for those programs and benefits standalone, and you do not need to be in one or the other to obtain one or the other. But in some cases, housing can play a huge role there if they can kind of kill two birds in one stone, provide these individuals with a place to lay their head and their children's head, and get them a way to at least buy groceries until they figure out something more permanent. So it's super, super important. Those violent crimes, fighting, stealing, places to sleep, that can also be reduced and eradicated when you have a place to live. And what I find is that many of the people who were considered repeat offenders on the street, folks who are fighting, say, women leaving DV situations that were fighting other women for many various reasons, people fighting over park benches, things like that, people that are stealing food, when they get their housing and they have that ability to focus on applying for these set programs, now they don't have to worry about that. We find that landlords end up building better relationships with those individuals because they are known in the community, they've been seen around, they're the ones that have usually called the police multiple times in those situations. We find that those relationships better and often reverse. And then you can build a camaraderie with neighbors, community, and neighborhood prevention programs. What I find is that in many low-income housing areas in New York City, there are many neighborhood programs that are associated with that housing project. And that's fairly new. I mean, there's always been prevention programs and neighborhood initiatives for many, many years, but we've seen an increase in them, and they've been on the rise a lot more than they have been before. So now the good thing about that is that not only are you saying, okay, here's stable housing and let's take you immediately out of your emergency situation, but now let's help you with some reintegration. Let's get you connected to the community, join your town hall. Here's an after school program that's local for the kids, that's free of charge for residents of said housing project. So it's, again, a trickle down effect, but now in a more positive way. So when we think about housing as a solution to disrupt some of the cycles of harm, we want to think about the ways that housing can do it that other interventions wouldn't. And I think that's super imperative to focus on. So housing is the first step. Physically removing the person from their abusive situation is always going to take precedence over food stamps, WIC, anything else. We need to get them out of that situation and giving them a place to get a better focus on the other things. So with housing, you can look for, you not only have rest, but you can focus on looking for work, food, financial stability, and all those programs that I've mentioned. Other interventions, I find that a lack with some of them is that they mainly focus on aftercare strategies, and there's not enough for prevention. So I call that like the Band-Aid effect. We'll say, okay, you don't have any food, your children don't have a place to stay, but we'll give you food stamps in some cases, right? So like that's an immediate Band-Aid. It helps you get a grocery or get groceries for now. However, you're not tackling the underlying issue or the long-term strategy. That's a short-term strategy, especially here. I know in New York City, there's a limit on food stamps. If you are approved and you're seeking that, you have a 5-year lifetime limit. So if you exceed 5 years at any point in your life, you can no longer receive the benefit. Additionally, there's a lot of paperwork that not only goes into the application, but that you have to continue monthly, quarterly, depends on where you are, to prove that you still need the benefit. And that can be an issue because now you gave me the Band-Aid, but you didn't treat the cut itself. And now there's an infection, right? So now we need to talk about how housing can serve or at least approach that underlying cause and effect. And that can look like figuring out the housing situation, focusing on the perpetrator, the abuser, focusing on how we can permanently sever that relationship if that's what is the best option in that situation. Oftentimes in a domestic violence situation, the person that is abusing is usually the father or the parent of those children. So depending on the situation, it could look very different, but it is important to not just slap a Band-Aid on the issue. I think that our communities need to focus more on prevention programs and strategies. We find that in low-income communities and affordable housing and subsidized housing communities and in shelters or emergency shelters, there is an increase in programs. I think there needs to be more. And some of these programs can look like DV workshops or intimate partner violence workshops. There are, at least in New York State, there is an increase in some of the services for survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. But there often aren't enough programs. And I know there's one, at least in my local community, and I am in a low-income community, but there is not enough programs that talk about preventing reoffenses, folks who are on parole, probation. There's not enough there's not enough programs that speak directly to folks about other ways that they can serve in the community that don't involve reoffending, stealing, fighting, things like that. So we need, and this is a bigger and a larger issue that we are not going to solve on this one panel discussion, but it is a way. I know housing can play a major role in that because they have the resources, the space, and the numbers. They have the population of individuals. You can establish more neighborhood initiatives within a low-income community alone. In domestic violence shelters, in emergency shelters, and safe placement, you can hold workshops in-house. These are things that can be done within the local community that don't necessarily exhaust too many resources. You don't need to crowdsource or crowdfund for it. You can take the individuals that are seeking these services or seeking the bed and say, we're offering this in-house. Here's daycare, here's an after-school program, here's a job reentry program that is not just let's focus on your resume, let's also focus on rebuilding some of the attachment issues that have us going back to our abusers and not being able to maintain gainful employment on their own. These are things that housing can do in-house that don't require much. There's usually a housing town hall or a community board. These are things that housing can do to contribute to that rehabilitation, if you will. And then because there is a lack of prevention initiatives, that Band-Aid again goes back to relying on the abusive partner or the abusive system because there's no way to address the underlying issue. So that brings me to transition into not only how housing itself as in the development can be helpful, but how can homeless systems overall and law enforcement play a better role of housing needs for individuals like myself. There can be implemented more safety protocols. The Department of Homeless Services, DHS as I call it, I think it's called something different in other states. They can incorporate more safety protocols for those with children, DV survivors, HT, intimate partner violence, especially for those with substance abuse disorders. So here in New York City and in New York State, if you are seeking a homeless shelter or applying to live in a homeless shelter, you have to go through a centralized place called PATH. PATH is one big establishment that literally all of us homeless individuals go into. And then we have to go through a multi-window process. You go from person to person to person. Each person is in a different department. There's medical, there's intake, there's this. And that process overall can take anywhere between 5 hours to 4 days. And in that 4 days, you are sleeping in the benches of PATH. There's no beds, there's no blankets. There was one time that they offered sandwiches. Sometimes you'll see churches that will volunteer and come down with hot food. But in those 5 hours to 4 days, there's a lot of reoffending and re-exploitation that occurs because there's not enough placement, there's not enough resources, there's no safety protocols. Children are out on the streets, people are sleeping outside of the establishment because they don't have any of the things that they need through PATH. By the time they reach the end of that intake process, they have not been assigned a shelter. Their pimps, their abusive partners have already come back and promised them better lives, better things for their children in that time frame. So safety protocols is something that housing systems and homeless systems can do better. Housing can find more subsidies or programs that offer free housing, at least for 1 year, for survivors of any one of these three. I think that is super important. It takes about a year for survivors to at least get on the track of going in the right direction shortly after leaving their abusive situation. Law enforcement can better integrate trainings in-house on how to approach not only survivors, but how we approach criminalizing them. And then lastly, when we talk about that Band-Aid effect, housing and homeless systems on a systemic level can incorporate more preventative reintegration programs, not just sending them to Workforce One and saying, here's a resume, let's get you a temp job, but also focusing on how to learn how to sustain yourself without being reliant on your abuser or your trafficking situation. So I'm going to leave it there. I am so thankful that you all stayed with me. I'm open to any questions or comments and concerns later on. I will drop my email in the chat, but thank you all so much for your time.
Wow, thank you so much, Melanie. That was great. Yeah, if you have any questions for Melanie or any questions in general throughout this panel, again, you can put them in the chat. And our final speaker for this panel is Solomon Middleton Williams of the Newark Community Street Team.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having us here. If we could just really take a moment of silence before I get into my remarks. We could take a moment of silence for those that we lost in Buffalo. Yeah, we could just take a moment of silence, please. Thank you. And the reason why we want to take a moment of silence as we talk about housing is because those individuals who lost their lives in Buffalo, New York, who were either possibly breadwinners, who were the primary care of the house, their families potentially will be facing eviction or a loss of home in the coming months. And so we want to keep that in mind as we talk about the role housing plays in violence. And so again, my name is Solomon Middleton Williams, and I serve as the Deputy Director for the Newark Community Street Team here in the great city of Newark, New Jersey, where our theory of change is that if we're able to service victims on the front end, we prevent them from becoming perpetrators. And to be quite honest, today is a struggle for me today because here in the city of Newark, I was late getting a call today, just full transparency, right? As we work in this space around housing and victimization, like I spent, before getting the call, probably like 10 minutes crying to my wife and friends around inequities around housing and how there's so much work to be done. But there are systems that are in play that keep us from all accessing equal housing. And I know a lot of people use the word affordable housing, low income housing, but the reality is that we really need equal housing so that housing can be accessible for all humans here in America and across the world. And we know that housing is not accessible to everyone. And that's why we're having this conversation around the role that housing plays in violence. And so again, we're super excited to kind of bring you a couple points, the way we view housing and the role it plays in violence and interpersonal violence. In the way that we can use a few strategies to support that. I want to say, normally when developers come into cities, they come into cities with a pitch. They want to build affordable housing, specifically here in the city of Newark. If you guys saw the news, you guys can Google this. The city of Newark is planning to build a $100 million movie studio production in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And this neighborhood was a public housing. It was low income, but it was also full of crime and poverty and drug use. And when I turned 18, I asked one of the former leaders here in the city of Newark, who was a political leader here, and I asked him, like, why did you allow, my neighborhood, which was predominantly African American and Hispanic, right? Why did you allow our neighborhood to be destroyed by violence and drug use? And he looked at me plainly and he said, it was too much money being made in that neighborhood. And I know, like, for me, my family, we were poor, so I knew we weren't making money, right? And I knew my neighbors weren't making money. Well, who were making money? Who was making the money, right? And the reality is that there are systems that are making and profiting money off of victims and violence. And so we must destroy these systems. We must stand up to these systems. We must advocate for the most vulnerable. And that's why I'm proud to be a member of the Newark Community Street Team. We focus our energy really on advocating for folks, but we also focus our energy on empowering residents to become advocates for their own communities. And although we do not specifically do housing, we do meet clients who have specific housing needs. And so I just want to jump into, like, what developers do here in the city of Newark and across the state, and show you how that's not working. And I want to lay a path forward what can work when we talk about reducing violence within neighborhoods and within communities. Developers come into neighborhoods and to communities and promising affordable housing, low income housing, and they say, listen, we're going to provide 10% of this development for affordable housing or low income housing. But quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, if I was to speak honestly about the 10%, the 20%, or the 30% that they offer, if you were to take a test and got a 10%, a 20%, and a 30%, you would have failed that test, quite frankly. And so, in fact, you would have to retake that test in order to seem competent to move to the next level. The reality is that developers are coming into cities and they are failing the communities that we're talking about. They are failing victims of crime. They are failing Black communities. And we must say, listen, if you're going to develop within our cities, well, we know that there's a high threshold, there's a high threshold for violence, there's a high threshold for crime in specific, there's a high threshold for poverty, there's a high threshold for unemployment, that we must address and bring housing into the ecosystem of public health and public safety. For too long, again, developers, landlords will come in and they will offer housing. But housing is only one part of the ecosystem, right? And that we must not only build and manage housing, but we need to provide services, as the two panelists said before me, right? We must invest in preventative strategies when it comes to violence in housing. NCST, we were founded in 2015 by Mayor Raz Baraka. He had a vision of employing residents to become vanguards in their neighborhoods. And 7 to 8 years later, we are still standing as an organization. We are ran by community members, and we are trained and deployed to respond to community needs, such as violence in housing complexes. The most of our violence that happens here in the city of Newark happens within these low-income tax credit neighborhoods. And there's a reason. There's a strong coalition because there are no services happening within these respective neighborhoods. And so we must invest in preventative strategies within these neighborhoods. When you go to a high-end apartment complex, you see the amenities. You see the dog parks, right? You see the free Wi-Fi. You see the free coffee, right? Snacks every other day. But when you go into low-income neighborhoods that are affected by violence and crime, you don't see these amenities. In fact, you see the opposite, as my co-panelists talked about. We see restrictions on who can come into your house, how long they can stay for, right? If you look at these policies are rooted within straight racism, and we must end these cycles. And if you work for an organization, I urge you to be courageous, to look at these policies that keep families apart, right? That we talk about, like, investing in strategies that work, right? Specifically around mediation conflict. How do we mediate conflict before it begins to become a violent incident, right? NCST, we mediate conflicts, we train, and we mediate to a peaceful outcome. These trainings can be employed and deployed within these respective neighborhoods that we see across the country that are struggling from violence, right? We must also, right, invest and incentivize peace within neighborhoods of violence. If we do not incentivize peace, we will continue to have the same thing that we have here. We will see the victim become the perpetrator. When we go to war, when America go to war, we go to other countries and we come with entire kind of diplomacy package, right? What Americans need, specifically low-income Americans need, is a diplomacy package that will support them around victim services. We did a survey 3 years ago in the city of Newark around victim services to see who knew about victim services. The reality is that 90% of victims did not know about victim services. And so we had to launch an entire campaign around victim services and what that looks like. But what we found out, what was really glaring, is that there is no access to housing when it comes to victim services. In fact, you would have to apply for VOCA, which is a reimbursable grant, which is racist in its originality, right, in its origin, because organizations will have to raise dollars to support victims of crime when the state already has, the federal government already has these dollars, right? And so we found out that there is no housing in the city of Newark for those who struggle from domestic violence and interpersonal violence. And so we are urging developers, we're urging landlords, we're urging lawmakers to really consider this, right? To really consider this, is that we are going to pay for housing one way or the other. We're going to pay for housing if we get them a low-income housing, as people like to say, affordable housing, or we're going to pay for housing when we see people within jails and prison industrial complexes. And so we have to make a conscious decision. Where do we want to invest our dollars at? Do we want to invest our dollars in public housing so that everyone has access to housing and equal housing? Or do we want to continue this cycle, this system that breaks and separates families, of violence that prevents people from becoming, having generational opportunities and generational wealth? And so the reality, again, is that we're going to invest these dollars into housing. It's like, who do we want to invest these dollars into? The people, or do we want to invest these dollars into the prison industrial complex? And far too long, we have been investing these dollars into the prison industrial complex. And I'll close on this so we can get into Q&A. NCST, we employ 72 employees. The reality is that 50% of our employees are homeless. I'm going to say that again, that 50% of our employees are homeless, meaning they're not on a lease, that they are sleeping on someone's couches, or they are actually in bandos, right? It is our job to advocate for them. It's our job to make common sense policies that allow folks who potentially had a rough background, who have a criminal background, to be able to access housing. Because when they do not access housing, they begin to become perpetrators of crime once again. It's important that we invest, again, not only in big developments, but within people, so that we can have safe neighborhoods so much. And so, I want to thank Homebase for having us here. I wanted to be short and specific to what we're trying to get accomplished. But again, we are fighting systems that are keeping families apart. We're fighting systems that continue to increase the crime rate here in the United States. And so we must work together collectively to reduce that. And that only way we can do that is investing within these communities and providing services for these folks. And so with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Solomon. And thank you to Melanie and Kate too. Let me spotlight all three of you, and we'll get going on our Q&A. Something that where is okay. I think so to get us started, I think you all kind of touched on this idea of housing as a tool for preventing harm. and kind of stopping cycles or spirals of harm, and how a lot of the interventions we currently use tend to exacerbate harm, or kind of, like Melanie mentioned, act as a Band-Aid that just kind of treat one small symptom. So a question for all three of you that kind of rolls up a lot of what's been going on in the chat is kind of like, how do you envision we can move away from these kinds of Band-Aid types of treatments and actually move towards kind of investing in communities and in housing upfront to prevent harm and violence? Any of you can feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think for me, for us here in the city of Newark, and I think this is like, it replicates across the country, right? Understanding like where these dollars are coming from. Most people accept the federal dollars to build and develop within poor neighborhoods, and so those dollars have restrictions on who can actually access housing. So if you're in the business of providing restrictions and separating families, you continue to accept these dollars, right? But if you're not on that team, right? If you want a team of keeping families together, preventing violence will happen in communities, we must urge our lawmakers on to remove policies and laws that separates families. That's the only way that we can do it. And we must elect people that have our best interests. And so, again, if you're in the business of separating families, you continue to accept money that separates families.
I completely agree. And just that we need to disconnect the criminal legal system from a person's access to housing. This is actually a relatively new feature of federal housing policy from the 90s that then permeated into the private market, because private landlords said, and localities said, well, if the federal government gets to do it, then I get to do it. And then all of a sudden we have separated Black families in particular from their loved ones on a system that is invalid and racist to begin with. It doesn't stabilize communities, it doesn't stabilize families, it doesn't reduce contact with the criminal legal system. It is not a valid predictor of a person's ability to be a good community member and tenant, and yet we just continue to use it and embrace it in a variety of forums.
I guess just to piggyback off of both of that, going back to like both Kay and Solomon's point, right? Like the system is innately racist. And if you don't address the systemic racism and the way that you approach the programs and policies, you're just going to keep getting the same effect. Right now in my low income community, they're trying to privatize it, right? But the problem is that none of us who actually live here are part of that decision, because the reality is, at higher levels, right, they benefit more from separating us, from criminalizing us, from not keeping our families together, than they do keeping us together and putting in the money to give us the resources we need. So it starts at many different places, but I do think that we need to address it at higher levels first. Solomon mentioned like taking the money, like the elected officials, right? Like, and Kate, you were saying like it doesn't make you any less of a participate, like a good community member or like an official. So I think that we need to like address it at higher levels, talk about the internal racist policies, have more meetings on how you're approaching these systems and how you view criminalization and those policies. And then you recognize how that trickles down to the community members. So.
Great. Yeah, thank you all so much. Another point that I want to get all of you to weigh in on that kind of were some common threads throughout all of your pieces. Kate, you mentioned these crime-free or nuisance ordinances that I think based on the chat, a lot of people were kind of shocked to hear about. Melanie, you mentioned briefly that there are now some like neighborhood or like community programs that are associated with affordable housing that kind of offer like safe communal spaces. And Solomon, of course, you talked about your work in kind of being a neighborhood program that does a lot of this work. So I was wondering if you could kind of tell us a little bit about how these kinds of neighborhood or community programs could be safe and like community-based alternatives to things like these nuisance ordinances.
If we can find a way to make some of the neighborhood programs we have here, if there was a policy that was developed for what the strategy will be, if somebody came and reported what they were going through to the community partnership first, then I think that can make a major difference. I think when we talk about the nuisance ordinances and as it relates to criminalization, we have to find a way for 911, 112, whatever your emergency code is, to not be our first responders under the current policy that they have. If there was a way to bring into our, neighborhood watches, your after school programs, the program that helps, the workshops that the emergency shelters have in place, if there was some type of response policy that these programs will have, where me as a DV survivor or a trafficking survivor can go across the street, in my case, to our neighborhood partnership and report some type of abuse there, and they had some type, and it has to align obviously with the legal system, but if there was a way for that to be my first place to go, as opposed to calling 911, knowing that it's going to be reported as a nuisance ordinance or affect the nuisance ordinance, I think that could make a huge difference. I do not have the answer on how to do that, but I think that there should be a way to implement our community partnerships and programs to be a first stop and first responding, as opposed to 911, as we see that it's a double negative for us. Will both be criminalized and our abuse will not be eradicated by doing so.
I don't think nuisance ordinances and crime-free programs were ever there or are ever there really to benefit tenants. Tenants are actually the target. And if you look at the literature and the sort of PR behind these ordinances and programs, including some template PowerPoints that police officers are encouraged to use in their localities, they say not all renters, one of the slides says, not all renters are criminals, but all criminals are renters. And that's a values frame, right? And we know because of structural racism and the racial wealth gap, more Black families are renters, right? Because that is a structural racism component of our society. And so you have to then understand the origin of that and not allow their space to sort of fix or correct these ordinances or programs around the edges. And if you're truly about, as a community, supporting tenants and all tenants, then you should design programs to actually benefit them, right? And those programs should actually come from tenant communities about what they need, which could be that they need help making sure that their property owners are responsive to repair needs, that their properties are safe from others coming in and trying to break into their units, or from perpetrators of violence trying to come in. Those are the things that when you talk to tenants and you work with tenants directly, that they will tell you that they want, and that they gain no benefit from these crime-free programs or nuisance ordinances, because the full premise of it is the problem.
Can I just add really quick? I saw the comment in the chat around the criminal aspect. Right, we're not ignoring the criminal aspect, right? We're saying that there are systems that are involved that inflates the criminal aspect, right? That's what we're saying, right? In your neighborhood, you may want, if somebody steals a child's bike, you may want them locked up. But in my neighborhood, I don't want them locked up for stealing that child's bike, right? What I want is a mediation, right? Because once that person is locked up, then they are then sentenced for whatever it is. They come back home and they're homeless. They don't have anything. They have to try to rebuild their lives. We're not ignoring the criminal aspect, but we're saying that if there is a crime or something that happens, let the community address it. This is why law enforcement doesn't really work well in Black neighborhoods, because law enforcement only enforces the law on Black neighborhoods, right? There's never a design where Black people can say, you know what, this is the way we view safety within our neighborhoods, right? And this is the way we want safety to be done. Instead, it is imposed upon us, such as housing is imposed upon us. We're not given the free choice to say, you know what, we want our cousins to stay here because they're homeless. We don't get that option, right? And so we're not ignoring the criminal aspect. We're saying there are systems designed, which is in policy and legislation, that creates the inflation of violence and crime within neighborhoods.
Can I just really quickly add to what you just said, Solomon, because I think that's super important, imperative to emphasize. I cannot speak today, but yeah, absolutely. And I want to reiterate that does not mean that we don't think that criminal activity and crimes deserve some level of accountability. But in our community, specifically in Black neighborhoods, in low-income communities, we are already targeted for something like stealing a child's bike. Right. So I know for me, I walk outside my door right now because I live in low income housing. There are 3 police vans just outside and they're just patrolling my neighborhood, waiting for me to go and put recycles where they shouldn't be, right? Or not recycling. And that can lead to my long-term housing instability later. That can lead to me being thrown into the prison industrial complex, which we already know targets people that look like me, darker, and males, right? So it's not to say that we're not going to address the crime at hand, but like you said, Solomon, a mediation or finding other alternatives to addressing something like that so that we're not thrown into this system that is lifelong for something that is a symptom of our lack of resources. And I think that when you focus on the lack of resources in low-income communities, then you begin to realize why certain choices are made out of desperation, out of vulnerability, out of marginalization. So I think it's super important that you raise that point.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And I think, yeah, I mean, what we're talking about now is really kind of getting at ideas of restorative justice or transformative justice. And, something someone just put really well in the chat is that, punishment and accountability are not the same thing. And that, while current systems either by design or inadvertently punish people, what we are looking for is accountability. And before we wrap up this panel, there's been a lot of interest in the chat in all 3 of you and the organizations you work for. So I was hoping if just to finish this off, if we can maybe just like go down the line and each of you can again say the organization that you're from, where that organization works, and how people can find out more about you or other similar organizations that might work in their communities. So maybe we'll go in order from Kate to Melanie to Solomon.
So I'm Kate Walls. I'm at the National Housing Law Project. We are based in San Francisco, California, but we have staff, including myself, all over the country. So I'm actually based in Chicago. And I will put my email in the chat. And I've been working on crime-free programs and nuisance property ordinances, and at this intersection of the criminal legal system and housing for about 15 years. And so it's a large part of my portfolio.
My name is Melanie Thompson. Again, I am the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women. We are an international organization that works to seek reducing, if not eradicating, human trafficking. So we focus a lot on advocacy and the policy development, both at the United Nations and at the federal level. I personally, in my own capacity, am a consultant on trafficking. So I do a lot of these speaking engagements, panels, education, workshops, and trainings. I put my email in the chat. I will drop it again if anyone has any additional questions or wants to reach out.
Thanks. Solomon Middleton Williams. Again, I serve as the Deputy Director for the Newark Community Street Team. We are based out of Newark, New Jersey. I'm proud to say I am a former perpetrator of system violence against people, as I worked in the housing space for 7 years, and I saw the harm that we've done to people developing. And so proud to say that I'm a former perpetrator of systematic violence.
Great, thank you all so much. And while we're again doing intros and a little plug before we move on, maybe our keynote speaker, Andrea, maybe you can do the same if you're prepared to to just speak for another minute.
Hello, I can. My name is Andrea and I am with Missy. And I can pop my email in there, and we support youth that are impacted by commercial sexual exploitation. We are based in Oakland, California, and I am based in Oakland, California. It's part of the community I serve.
Great. Again, thank you all so much. And Viola, do you want to let us know what's coming next?
Yes, so we are now going to take a 5-minute break and come back at 11:18 Pacific time. And when we return together, we are going to hear from our second group of panelists. We're going to be talking about interrupting harm through community housing partnerships. So stay tuned. We'll see you in 5 minutes. All right, everyone, thank you for joining us, coming back to us after this break. I am going to go ahead now and pass it off to my colleague, Michelle, who is going to be moderating panel 2, which is interrupting harm through community housing partnerships.
Great. Thanks so much, Viola. And thank you so much to our first panel and to our keynote speaker. I just feel like this has been such a great, we've heard from so many great people so far, and I really appreciate that. So as Viola said, my name is Michelle Burns. I'm a directing analyst with Homebase, and I'm going to be moderating the second panel today. And what we are going to be focusing on today is really understanding how housing programs and public safety partners can work together to support survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. We will be centering the voices of survivors in identifying effective practices, and also learn from specific programmatic approaches that have demonstrated success in working with survivors. And I'm really excited about this. I think this is a great follow-up to our last panel in terms of, and complementary to the panel in terms of talking about some of the partnerships that we can have also across different service sectors. So let me just tell you who we will be joined by today. If you could go to the next slide. Our first panelist is going to be Detective Melinda Zen, who is with the Morgan Hill Police Department. We will then be hearing from Tammy Cooper Garvin, who is with Home Free. She's the assistant director there. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Cristiano Eduardo, who is a survivor and consultant with Shabana Powell Consulting and an advocate. And like I said, I will be facilitating the Q&A. It'll be following the same format as the first panel. So we will be hearing from the 3 panelists, and then we will have the opportunity to direct your questions to them. So please continue to put your thoughts and questions into the chat. And then at the end of the presentations, then I'll be directing those to the panelists. So with that, I would like to introduce Detective Zen. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yes, my name is Melinda Zen. I am a detective with Morgan Hill Police Department. I've been with the Morgan Hill Police Department for approaching my 25th year here. And I'll just tell you a little bit about where I'm from. So I was born and raised in Fresno, the eldest of 5. My mom was a single mother my whole childhood. I experienced domestic violence in the home and drug abuse. And so the kids and I, my siblings and I, were exposed to a lot. We were hungry oftentimes. We've had our power turned off on us. My mom had to do laundry by hand. So how did I become a police officer? I don't know. I think it was just something that happened. I was always a helper. And in my profession, I've always tried to help with the foresight that I know what it's like to be down and out, when I know what it's like to be hungry. And so I've always just tried to do the right thing, treat people well. So I've done a lot of my work focus on those things. So we've talked a lot about housing, which, by the way, the first panel was amazing. And I just felt all the energy and all the creativity. And I wish there were just so many more of us that could just keep going. And, you know, it takes a village to really impact one person and make change happen. So in my career here at Morgan Hill PD, I've had a really wonderful opportunity that I'm very thankful to have still, is work with Community Solutions, and they are our advocacy organization here in Morgan Hill. Their headquarters is in Gilroy, which is our city next door, but we have an office here in Morgan Hill, and I've learned so much about survivor-centered advocacy and work and in service of them. And so Community Solutions, they help support survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault. We also do, we also have a partnership with Community Solutions through the Family Justice Center. The first Family Justice Center began in Morgan Hill, and it was such a hit that now there are 3 others in the county. And we've had really wonderful success with supporting our survivors through the South County Family Justice Center. Comes to housing, the Morgan Hill Police Department and the Community Solutions partner together, and also our DA's office. We pull together our resources on how to shelter folks that are become unhoused because they have been victimized, or because we learned that they were unhoused and need support, and it's not through a police call for service that we learned of them. So the Morgan Hill Police Department has temporary housing, emergency housing vouchers through the United Way funds. It's a partnership that Silicon Valley United Way has with law enforcement. And so basically we can house somebody in a hotel for a night or longer, maybe 2-3 days max, until we work on whatever the next step is. And that's just to keep them safe, get them into a safe place while other things that they're dealing with are being coordinated. And then also Community Solutions has the shelter, has a shelter, and also other shelter options like hoteling or survivors. And then also the DA's office provides funds to continue that housing until we can support the survivor through other means, short-term, long-term, through other programs. And so we do that work, and that's a very important work. I heard all the conversation, Melanie had a really great conversation about how housing stabilizes folks, and when they're unhoused, how unstable they can be and are. And not only for them, but for those that try to help them. And that is absolutely true. I've seen it firsthand. And so housing is very important. It is one of those basic needs to keep people safe, to keep them mentally well, and continue move forward in their lives with other support, right? It can't be done alone, and I recognize that. So that's me and Community Solutions. We do awesome work. I did want to highlight that Community Solutions does support criminalized survivors by having a reentry program. It's actually very exciting work. It's full services, case management, individual counseling, medication support, crisis intervention, referral and linkage to other services and groups. They do that for adults and juveniles. So they also have a juvenile reentry aftercare program, which also provides the same services. Basically, it's ongoing support, mental health care, therapeutic work, and providing additional resources and connecting these resources with this population to get them well and whole. And then they have a jail diversion program as well. Same thing, supporting the person, trying to find alternative means and programs in lieu of jail. And also they have a mental health program for parolees, which are those that have not only gone to jail, but went on into the prison system. So they do integrative services for the mentally ill parolees. So they offer a lot of services for criminalized survivors, even offenders, to keep them folks from reoffending and get people well and whole so that they can get on with their lives in a healthy way. So that's my work with Community Solutions. And other part that I wanted to talk about was the City of Morgan Hill. So the City of Morgan Hill has a really robust housing services program. And so I heard about when developers come into town and they make all these promises, and we do have developers that come into Morgan Hill and want to build high density housing. It's affordable housing. And the City of Morgan Hill works very closely with the developers and doesn't say yes to every developer that comes through, because this is California, this is the Bay Area. The housing crisis is nationwide. But if you go to San Francisco, you go to Stockton, you go along our freeways, and you'll see that the housing, the unhoused situation needs some fixing, right? We need to help and solve this problem, do it together. So the City of Morgan Hill partners with developers that do focus on our low income populations. And so we have a couple of those developments in town. And a lot of the developers bring in support services for the new tenants. And this can be in terms of like whatever the family needs are. It's tailored to whatever those needs are, that they'll be given a case manager or a mental health peer worker. Programs have support. We just recently, the County of Santa Clara, which is the county I'm in, recently approved affordable housing that is going to focus on our, let me find it here, our farm workers. 30 apartments for farm workers, 18 for rapid rehousing to help homeless individuals and families with special needs, and 24 units for low-income families. So we're trying to focus on different populations to address the housing needs in this area, which is very expensive to live in. So I'm very excited about that. And then we have our unhoused specialist. His name is Brian. He goes out and makes contact with unhoused individuals and offers them resources and gets them connected to housing. It initially begins through emergency housing and then other avenues of support that open up to long-term housing programs, right? So it could be a mental health program, it could be substance abuse program, survivor-centered programs. So we try to engage our unhoused and get them the help that they need through Brian. And one of the other things that I do is I'm on the mental health team for the Morgan Hill Police Department. It's called the PERT team, Psychiatric Emergency Response Team. I partner with a clinician, and we go out and make follow-up contact with people who were in crisis or are in active crisis, and or family members of those that have a mental health diagnosis. And we provide resources, again, that are specific to this individual or this family's needs, resources to give them support, that they're not alone, maybe improve services they already have or that they don't have, so that they learn about what's available out there to keep them well. Know that they're not alone, give them numbers to call when crisis is arising and they see it and they'd like to curb it. And we do that because we want people to know where they can go to, instead of waiting for, not knowing that they can get help before there's a crisis, and then there would be a law enforcement response, right? So law enforcement is changing now. We don't want to be the first responder on calls that aren't police calls for service. We want folks to be able to know what programs are out there for them that exist in the community outside of law enforcement that they can reach out to, and the support is there. It's designed specifically for them and to meet their needs. And I wanted to touch on this. I heard somebody saying that victim services unit means you have to cooperate with law enforcement. So Santa Clara County does have a victim services unit through the district attorney's office. And those are cases where investigations have been conducted and people have been apprehended and there's a court process. But you don't have to cooperate. You can get the same help through nonprofits or community-based organizations that offer the same type of help. And so when we talk about victim services, we're talking about Marcy's Law, right? What are you entitled to in the state of California when you're the victim of a crime? And there are a lot of organizations that can help you meet those outside of a victim services unit if you're apprehensive about that. You can't be forced to become a victim or a witness in a case. It's your option. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that the Morgan Hill Police Department has a juvenile diversion program, and we focus on restorative justice circles because we don't want to arrest minors and incarcerate them for things that have happened, right? We want to restore the child, give them healthy options and outlets, and learn healthy behaviors. And sometimes that includes the family support, the whole family counseling support services as well. And then there's another thing I wanted to talk about because I'm really excited. I really like being Morgan Hill PD, and I think we're doing some good things. Morgan Hill PD has a community crime prevention unit. And although the title is Crime Prevention Unit, we don't focus on crime prevention. We focus on community outreach. And what that means is we go out to our communities, our dense housing communities and neighborhoods, and we ask them, what can we do to support your immediate community, your neighbor? What would you like to see from us? So we're hearing it directly from them, and then we're coming back and giving that return right back. If that's a presentation on bike safety, or how do you get to college, or whatever it is, right? What programs are in the community? We return it and give that presentation to them. So there is a follow through for the police department and with the crime prevention unit, and that's at the top of our list. So we don't focus on enforcement on the communities when they ask us for outreach, when they reach out to us and tell us what they want. There's a question here. Often people are not advised fear of retaliation for not cooperating, freedoms or amenities being withheld if they don't. So I don't think I understand it entirely, but law enforcement can't force anybody to become a witness if they've been testified against somebody. But yes, there are coercive behaviors and the batterers or abusers' conduct that can be used to manipulate a victim of a crime. That is a very real thing. Fear of retaliation is a very real thing. law enforcement can't make promises about keeping them safe if they testify, but that's why it's up to them. And I totally understand that. I mean, we all do. It's the same way where you have familial violence, and the person that's being victimized doesn't want to prosecute the family member because they love them, right? That's their family member, and it has a bigger impact than just saying, I want this person arrested. So have a long way to go. I think Morgan Hill PD, the city of Morgan Hill, Community Solutions has a really great partnership. Also have a property managers group where we provide all the available resources to our property managers so they can share with their communities, such as the mobile library that can come to your apartment complex and bring the books to you and you check them out. We have the hot lunches during the summer. We have after school programs on your properties available from the school district. They'll come in and tutor the child or do a whole family setting. So we also provide that to our community so that they are engaged and they become aware. And I think educating our community is very important. And we do that through our meetings, our community, and letting people know about the resources that exist for their situation.
Our neighborhood, but I pay.
Is there a next page? I think there's a safe parking on the next page. So when it comes to unhoused families, because the Bay Area is so expensive to live in, we do find families living in cars and RVs, and sometimes they're single adults, and sometimes they do have children with them. And so the city of Morgan Hill has a safe parking program, and people are vetted to come into the safe parking program, and they are provided support services and a pathway to long-term permanent housing. I wanted to mention one more thing regarding our developers that come into town. Some of the affordable housing that we have is for TAY housing, transitional aged youth housing. These are kids that have aged out of foster care system or have been trafficked. And so we do have housing for them in our communities. And again, those communities do also come with case managers, a clinician, mental health support.
Great. Thank you very much, Detective Zen. And thank you also for the everyone's engagement today. I really just appreciate being able to hear from multiple perspectives on this really important issue. And I want to now turn it over to our next panelist. That's Tammy Cooper Garvin, and she is the Assistant Director of Home Free. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tammy. Welcome.
I'm so sorry, Tammy, you're muted.
Hello, I'm very sorry for that one. Hi, my name is Tammy. I'm the Assistant Director of Home Free, and I have lived experience as I've been incarcerated for 28 years, human trafficking and domestic, and also domestic violence. Home Free has been open, it's a little over almost 2 years. It opened November of 2020 when the pandemic happened. So Home Free focuses on transitional co-housing program that helps criminalized survivors of domestic violence re-enter communities and thrive. We help the ladies here do groups, get jobs, make sure they have their ID, their social security, and we just help them move along so they can succeed in life. Home Free created created to provide a restorative environment for women who serve long prison sentences resulting from their experiences of gender-based violence. So the women here, some have killed their abuser, some have been abused over and over and over, and have been coerced from their abusers that have been sent to prison. Services include case management, guided reconnections with family, trauma services, and practical life skills here. Can I have the next slide, please? Home Free is unique. Its design is very unique. It's like no other program. This program here, the ladies live two women to an apartment, and there's no blackout period. In other programs, like you can't have your phone, you have blackout periods, you can't go out, you have to wait to go find a job. But here, Home Free is different. We want you to succeed. We want to help you integrate back into society. So all the other things we don't have. We have the goodness of Home Free, the freshness, the happiness. Home Free is designed as a place of happiness. Apartments are filled with natural lights. We have access to garden space. There's shared space in apartments, but we have, like, in the gardens, you can just go outside and just find peace. And where Home Free is very quiet. Could I have the next slide, please? Program elements of Home Free: housing's first approach, individualized trauma-informed, culturally relevant services. We emphasize on self-determination and living life. We could clearly define roles between parole and Home Free. The parole officers, the parole agents, they don't like to be called officers. The agents that come to Home Free, that for our parolees, the agents, they love Home Free. They don't even have to really worry about their clients here at Home Free. Can I have the next slide, please? Program graduates receive family reunification support, secure employment, and move into stable housing. We have people have graduated from the program here, and have bought homes since they have graduated, and work and have really good jobs. Next slide, please. My phone number, my contact is right here at the end. But if you want to know anything else about Home Free, you can ask me with the questions and answers later. And I appreciate this, Michelle, so much. And I was nervous, and I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness, Tammy, don't apologize. Thank you so much for bringing your experience, your expertise. We are so happy to have you here. And I do have some questions that I'll be directing your way at the end. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you. One thing, Home Free is very unique. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'd now like to introduce Cristiano Eduardo, who is here as an advocate, a survivor, and a consultant. And welcome, Cristiano Eduardo.
Hello, everyone. To be honest, I'm very excited that this conversation is happening. And that there is a lot of engagement in the chat. Like, that's great to see, because I think that having these conversations without really touching around harms and the real problems, it's a lot of times what I'm seeing happening. I'm like, oh, systems are working, everything is working fine, we just need to continue doing what we're doing. But I really like that some of ideas are being challenged on the chat. So thank you so much for everyone who is sharing their thoughts, their ideas in the chat. I really, truly appreciate that. So my name is Cristiano Eduardo. I am a survivor of international domestic sex and labor trafficking. I am originally from Mexico. I am a non-native English speaker. I'm part of the LGBT community. I identify as a gay male, and I'm a person living with HIV. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how homelessness intersect with criminalization and what are the responses that I have went through. I'm based in New York, and I have been here in the United States around 7 years. And through all these 7 years, I have navigated the housing system, the health system, like really like all the systems. And I just want to know one thing, that a lot of times organizations talk about housing as an isolated thing that is happening of the void, but the reality is that it really intersects with literally everything, like especially when we are talking about survivors and victims. And a lot of times that's why we really need like community engagement, because there are no responses. A lot of times shelters, they don't have the answers, the resources, and the answer and the resources out there in the community, but because they don't know about the services and these resources, they cannot connect the people that need this through all these services and resources that are available. So first, I want to start with saying that homelessness is not a choice. I have heard so many times from service providers, from a lot of times from law enforcement, from other organizations, from other people, that people are experiencing homelessness because they want, because they are not working hard enough, because they don't like working full time, because they are lazy. And that's not the reality, specifically when we're talking about survivors of domestic violence, human trafficking. We lack an understanding of the trauma. A lot of times people who are suffering from mental health, oftentimes they are labeled as problematic, as negative, as lazy people, as people that don't want to follow the system. And this is not the reality. And as it was shared before, the systems that are supposed to support us and help us, they have been failing us, especially like victims of gender-based violence. Again, domestic violence, intimate violence partner, human trafficking. I remember that when I escaped from my trafficking experience, I was kind of referred to a general male shelter. And I went to the intake, and the first barrier that I encountered was that nobody spoke Spanish. But that time I wasn't able to speak fluently in English. And the reality it was that I remember that it was like 5 p.m. and they really wanted to finish. They were just like, yes, come in. They were doing the intake super quick. I remember clearly one of the questions was have you ever changed sex for something of value? And I answered yes. Was there any follow-up? No. That question is really to highlight that a person is in high risk of trafficking or a situation of trafficking. It wasn't the first time that question was asked to me on a housing shelter, on a transitional program, on so many housing systems. I got asked that question, and I never received any follow-up, any follow-up, any resource. Nobody really asked me what is happening, what was the story behind it. So when we are talking about homelessness, there are a lot of systemic barriers. A lot of them, some of them are racism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, language barriers, and discrimination. Again, stigma and discrimination are heavily, and most of the time we really assume, and we have been taught, that homeless people are drug users, that they're violent, that they don't deserve help, that they are using resources that could be used for other things. And the reality is that that's not the truth. Violence and abuse is another thing that really creates a situation of homelessness, domestic violence, intimate violence partner, human trafficking. And this really intersect with criminalization and incarceration. A lot of times domestic violence, intimate violence partner, and human trafficking survivors, because we are under coercive control, we commit crimes, non-violence and violent crimes. And this really affects our records. A lot of times when we escape from trafficking, abuse, or violence situation, it's because it's our last resort. really hoping that people on housing systems are really going to understand. One thing that I have seen is that most of the time in housing system, they receive one training a year about what is domestic violence, one training a year what is human trafficking, one training a year about intimate violence partner, and that's all. When they interact really with the community, they cannot identify. They a lot of times they don't really have the resources, the information. What should I do if I detect this? Should I just let it go? Should I call the police? Should I don't call the police? And I think that this is the first piece where community initiatives and community programs came in. I remember that when I was navigating the housing system, I didn't know what to do because after my trafficking experience, I didn't have family, friends, no work. I was afraid of my legal status. I was afraid, of course, of all the police because most of trafficking victims are convicted of are by police. They are they have crimes around loitering, prostitution, and most often the time, like human trafficking victims have a lot of criminal records. So calling the law enforcement wasn't an option to me. So when I went to the housing system, I was like, well, hopefully they have an answer. They know what to do with me. By that time, I was just recently diagnosed HIV positive. They really also didn't know what to do to me. They were like, are you receiving your medication? Are you okay? Do you need something else? But the reality is that I was referred to a general male shelter. What is the problem with this? Remember that sex trafficking survivors, we are victims of sexual abuse and violence. Imagine me coming out of my experience of trafficking, arriving to a place where everyone identify as a male, in a room, four walls, full 30 beds on there, me not knowing what was happening, me afraid of the other males like abusing me, me suffering the consequences of trauma, receiving no support, no one is speaking Spanish. The first thing, I remember that I arrived at night, the first thing in the morning at 5 a.m., what I heard was one of the staff member coming, knocking on the wall and say, everyone wake up, do something with your lives. And this just only show the stigma, the discrimination, the lack of trauma-informed approaches, victim-centered, and how we are housing staff are not being trained. And it's not their fault. The fault is from the system that it's a lot of times giving them a lot of cases, overtime, burning them down. They are not acknowledging how vicarious trauma intersect with personal trauma, especially in housing system. My case, I still think that it was very hard. An immigrant, HIV positive, gay male, and one other thing that I think that we rely a lot is self-identification and the screening tools. Until today, I have been working in the anti-trafficking field for 4 years. I have been advocating for the immigrant and LGBTQ+ community for almost 6 years. I had never met a person who approached to me and say like, oh, I'm a victim or I'm a survivor of human trafficking right now because someone is controlling me, using my immigrant, like, no. Like I wasn't able to identify myself as a victim of human trafficking. A lot of times people who are victim of domestic violence, they are not able to identify themselves. Intimate violence partners, and what we are expecting in the housing system is that people come and say like, hi, hello, my name is this, and this is my situation. I identify myself as a victim of this. That is not going to happen. A lot of times when we are reaching out and looking for services, it's because we're afraid of our lives. And the reality is that going through all these tools of the intakes, the screening tools, a lot of times we don't even know what we are answering. That's the reality. And a lot of times like staff are really inhuman. Like even if we start sharing a little bit of our story, they're like, yes, let's continue with the next question. And we're like, okay, I see that nobody really cares. Can we go to the next slide? Yes, so we need to remember people who are homeless are 11 times more likely to be arrested. Why? When we are talking about housing, we are not just talking about a place to stay. We are talking a place where I can feel safe, where I can have a good night's sleep, when I have access food, water. I think that a lot of times all these needs that most of the time we have covered, we never think about it. Like water is a huge issue. Where do you get water if you don't have money, if you don't have transportation, if you don't have a place where you can drink water? Seriously, this is a huge issue. Where do you get a place where you can urinate, when you can defecate? Like these are very serious issues that a lot of times we are afraid or we're shy to talk. Like the reality is that, for example, when I was living in the shelter, I needed to leave at 10 a.m. Why? I don't know. They told me that day you need to leave at 10 a.m. You can come back at 3, 4 for lunch. And I was like, what am I supposed to do? Like, what am I supposed first to move? Where am I going to get food or water during the day? Where am I going to do my necessities? And I was like, well, no, you cannot do this. The reality is that they are doing it. And I was very afraid, like, to even ask. They didn't speak Spanish, so with my broken English, I was trying to communicate. I think that, again, this is very just highlighting how we need a community approach. There are so many community organizations, community-based organizations that can give this, like, for people who are experiencing homelessness. And the reality is that we all are here because we want, our goal is like long-term, safe, affordable, and stable housing. The reality is that this should be a linear path that is like, yes, here are the structures already, here are the points of entry, like you're going to receive the services that you deserve, the compassion, the kindness. We're going to have a cultural approach, language access, but the reality is that no. Every single step when you are looking for housing, it feels like really hiking a mountain, and a lot of times it's disrupted and you just go back to the beginning. Like, I'm not kidding. Like, and we start from the stigma, prejudice, and discrimination. A lot of service providers, like, the body language is telling you everything. Oh, here we have, like, for example, it was very obvious to me when I was looking for housing that because I look young, because I'm a male, because I wasn't in distress, it was their body language saying, like, why are you not working? Why are you looking for housing? What do you want? Why do you want, like, to receive these services? Like, you don't deserve that. There are people who, and they don't need to say it. Like, I think that here it's when comes the part of understanding the communities that you're working, understanding really how to be trauma informed. The reality is that we don't really understand the impact of trauma. So that was the first barrier that I really encountered. So a community approach, like really housing entities, housing programs should know the community that I'm working with. Another thing that I really saw was that, and I have been seeing that there were no Latino staff or no people who spoke Spanish. That was very unwelcoming. I was so afraid. I was like, why if they are all against me? Why? And this really intersects with xenophobia, like hate against immigrants, what we have been seeing, and hate against, like, it can be Black people, Indigenous people, hate against, like, homeless people, like how all these sites are unwelcoming, are not safe, and are not really trauma-informed. The second barrier, as I say, is the language barrier. Okay, finally, someone is giving me services, regardless, like, the stigma, prejudice, and discrimination that I'm seeing, that I'm receiving. Like, I cannot do anything. I just need, like, to literally breathe, even if they are making faces, their body language, even the way that they are speaking to me, if there is disrespectful, like, what can I do? The reality is that anything, because I need the services. Well, the second barrier, the language barrier. Okay, now I need to find a place where I can communicate effectively. What I discovered is that a lot of times they were using non-trauma informed translations. And the translator was saying totally different than I was saying. And I was like, wait. I'm not saying that like that. That's not really my story. I think that, again, the community approach, the cultural approach is so important around translations. One other big thing, lack of documentations, and IDs. I don't know why people assume that when we are survivors of human trafficking, domestic violence, intimate violence partner, we are living with like all the stuff. Oh, of course, I know what the shelter is going to ask me, so I'm going to have all the documentation like ready in order. The reality is that not. A lot of times we escape just with what we have in our pockets. And we don't have ID. We don't have documents. And even that, as an immigrant, I can tell that we are afraid of giving our documents or ID. Is this going to impact me? Am I going to get deported? Is there information shared with police? Is there information shared with any kind of law enforcement, with ICE? Like, should I give my real name? Should I not give my real name? What should I do? And again, it's knowing your community. I think that here we really need, especially talking about immigrants, people who lack documents, we really need a community approach, an organization that really understands what is happening, an organization that really understand the impact of trauma, and not only like seeing people as like, oh, well, you need services, whatever, like we need your ID. Like there's more behind that. A lot of times human trafficking survivors, our documentation is withheld by our traffickers. So what are we gonna do? How are we gonna escape a situation if we're gonna receive this type of services? Screen failing and self-identification, as I was saying before, I believe, and I have seen, and I continue seeing, that a lot of services are like demanding for the people to self-identify. It took me years of working with community organizations, with therapists, with doctors to really recognize that I was a victim of human trafficking. I didn't arrive to any shelter, to any place saying like, hi, I'm a human trafficking survivor. Like, can you give me services? Like, no, I'm a domestic violence survivor. Like, I'm having issues with drugs. Can you help me? Like, I think that we really need to understand how like all these things are not happening isolated, how they intersect with trauma, how they intersect with identity, gender, religion, like immigration status, and really created screening tools that not only give us a trauma-informed and centered victim approach, but also have a resource list with community services and resources where we can connect people with. What I have seen is that housing services, especially like governmental services that are receiving funding from government, they just network with other organizations who have federal grants or who have like federal funding. Usually they don't network with community-based organizations, with nonprofits. A lot of times that happened to me. I remember that when I was after the screening, they were like, oh, so it looks like your needs are you're HIV positive, you don't have an immigration status. And what they do is they send me to, I don't remember, I think that it was health services organization. I arrived there and they were like, oh, you are not a citizen, so we cannot do anything. And I was like, oh, great. So what was the screening for? What was the referral form? If after all this thing, like navigating all the system by myself, I'm going to write a referral thinking that I'm going to receive not only like continue the housing, but all the other resources that I need, just to being told like, oh, we cannot help you. And this is very connected with the next one, the lack of holistic resources. A lot of times we expect that shelter and housing have all the services. That is something that it's not going to happen, to be honest. I think that this is where we need to create alliances, to really connect with community-based organizations, nonprofits, because it's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about like creating this network where we can know that the people who is receiving housing services, they are also going to receive like health services, legal services, education skill services, like labor skill services, and all these things. And not only just focusing on housing, because if we just focus on housing, it's again, like we are putting people on the path for failure. So what's happening is that a lot of times living in a shelter is not safe. The wheel is not moving. We people ended up like on the street again. And here we go again. We start from the beginning again. What is this happening? Screening failing, demanding of self-identification, lack of holistic resources. One other big thing, and I share with all of you that when I started living in the homeless shelter, I was sharing the bed with 30 people. One time, one of the all the other people who were living in the shelter at night tried like to sexually assault me. What I was gonna do? Like, if this was the safe place where I wanted to be, the reality is like a lot of shelters, they are not trauma informed, they are not safe, and there are no services in housing spaces for survivors. That's the reality. One other big thing that I want to highlight, I was denied for housing shelter, for victim shelters, because I identify as a male. We need to stop, and this is not for minimizing that the majority of people who suffer gender-based violence are women or identify as females, but there is a lack of services for male. These put males who are victims of intimate violence partner, for human trafficking, like they put us on big risk. Like, why should I go in a space where I'm going to be sexually assaulted again, where I'm going to receive like discrimination, a stigma, where when I'm afraid again of being like receiving all this abuse and violence? That it doesn't make any sense to live a situation of abuse or violence if I'm going to move into another space of abuse and violence. So I think that we need to increase really services that are inclusive. Services for the LGBTQ plus community. There are a lack of services and an understanding. I remember that when I was living in the shelter, I saw a transgender woman because their ID has a male name. They didn't allow her like to enter like other type of services, and it was, trust me, it was horrible. Like, I identify as a gay male. I was receiving, of course, like verbal abuse, like usually oftentimes like, what are you doing here? Are you looking at me? Like all this abuse and violence. But the abuse and violence toward this transgender woman, it was so open. Any of the staff was doing anything. It was totally normalized. Nobody wanted like to, oh, you know, like let them be, that, you know, they are all problematic of, or homeless people are problematic. They're always, and they want services. I was hearing stuff like that. What I was gonna do, I was like, oh my God, this is totally unsafe for me. Like, why did I escape my trafficking situation? And that time, like, why did I escape where I was living to change for this if I seen that they hate me? Like, and I think that this is a great example of how connections and alliance with community-based organization, it's really needed. This person, myself, we really needed services from LGBTQ plus resources inclusive, and it was a pain, seriously. And this is continually happening. Like a lot of times, survivors and victims, we cannot say anything, like seriously anything. If we complain about it in housing services, oh, you don't want to live here? Okay, like you can sign like that you cannot want to live here anymore, and that's all. Like, and what really opportunities do we have? And again, safety issues, it's a big time. So if after navigating all these things, we are here receiving housing services, we are here like, okay, whatever, people don't understand what is human trafficking, they are not trauma informed, they are not victim centered, guess what? There is another big barrier when we're looking for long-term, safe, affordable, and stable housing. Criminal record, our credit score, incarceration, immigration status, inaccessible systems. Most of the long-term, safe, affordable, and stable housing, they require like you literally like to be like a saint. I'm not kidding. Like, and a lot of times because of our lived experience, like society and this, we are unqualified for all the system. So it's like, oh, great. Like, so I have been enduring all this pain, all this trauma from the system is failing me. And now that I'm just one step closer, like this happened again. So I think that we really need to be mindful of the services that are being offered around the states, be culturally inclusive, be mindful of language, and really train the staff. And the other part is really recognizing the vicarious trauma. I think that homelessness really intersects with so many other issues So let's not minimize like the harm and the trauma that our staff are exposed to. So with this, I'm just closing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for all the great work that every single one of you are doing. Seriously, like during all my path, the staff that treat me as a human being, like make a huge difference. Like, thank you so much for caring about us. Thank you so much for supporting. And I know that we are against a big system, but we are doing our part. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristiano Eduardo, and to all of our panelists. We do have time for some questions right now. We've gotten a number of them. The first question I wanted to ask is to Tammy. Tammy, can you speak to how clients and participants come to be at Home Free? How do you identify them? How do they learn about your program?
Okay, how they get to Home Free. I'm also the re-entry coach here at Home Free. So I reach inside the prison and I vet women to come here. You know, I email back and forth, or they write me letters, and there's a process. I send out 11 questions, and a lot of women have a lot of domestic violence and human trafficking in their past. I vet them. You know, what we wish was as Home Free was bigger, that we could help more people, because this place is just so unique. And what was the other question, Michelle? I'm sorry.
No, that was helpful. So how they come to you. So it sounds like you have a connection to the prisons themselves, so that then you can connect them to the housing when they are coming.
And we put posters. We put posters inside the prisons, the 2 women's prisons here in the state of California. We put send out with postcards I sent out, so you know they're known. You know, they know all about Home Free.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Detective Zen. Can you talk about how what steps you all have taken, the Morgan Hill Police has taken, to build trust within the community of unsheltered folks that you work with?
Somewhere else.
Yes, so we have a lot of outreach from our community as a whole. And so we have our local church that provides gift bags to the police department so that we can provide. Also have another organization that provides us backpacks. Now, both of these packages have something for the entire year. So we have warm blankets and jackets, socks, toiletries, snacks, water, COVID, masks. The backpacks have $5 for transportation if they're trying to get back to where they're from. And then also we have our Unhoused liaison that partners with the Morgan Hill PD to go out and offer resources. And then we have our psychiatric emergency response team that makes contact with them and again offers them additional resources, mostly related to mental health and or sobriety. And our homeless population, we almost know them all by first name basis. We have meals, hot meals for them, provided by our churches and some of our restaurants. So it's a huge community effort with the police department to support our unhoused population.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is for Cristiano Eduardo. You talked a fair amount about some of the lack of trauma-informed services that you experienced, and I was wondering if you could talk about any success stories that you may have seen or examples of service approaches that can be used to not re-traumatize participants and to really start to address that.
Yes, actually, the person who was my lawyer really had an understanding of human trafficking. The first thing is that she didn't label me. She went through with me with this psycho education about what is human trafficking, what is happening to you, like that you receive help and all these things. And that was a really big support. Something that I would recommend to everyone, because it has been one challenge in all system, is that knowing what are the legal reliefs for survivors of human trafficking. What is a T visa, what is a U visa, and not only that asylum, political asylum is one resource for legal reliefs, because I'm not kidding. I think that 90% of all the systems that I have navigated, and in all levels, even college, it happened that when I say like, oh, I am a T visa holder, they thought that I was a tourist for the T. And I was like, what's happening here? And they were like, you're here visiting? And I was like, this is just very bad. So I need to explain this. And it's something that I really encourage everyone, like, to educate yourself. And the reality is that through my housing experience, I did meet so many amazing people that they weren't asking invasive questions. I think that was very helpful. Things like how you were trafficked, how long you were trafficked, did they pay you? Like, please don't ask this to survivors and victims unless it's your work, unless it's required. Don't let your curiosity become a barrier. Because with a lot of my caseworkers, that was a barrier. I was like, this is very invasive. Am I asking you, like, how do you engage on sex, or like about your past violence and abuse? That was extremely helpful to me, receiving all these services without like, okay, what do you want to do? Like, what are the services that you want to receive? What is your goal? And these other people that really engage with me as a human being, I think that was the best takeout. Like, and that's the best recommendation that I have. All survivors and victims, they are also human beings. We never stop being human beings. We have goals. We want like to a safe, happy life. So meet the victims and survivors where they are.
Great, thank you so much. And again, I want to say a huge thank you to Detective Zen, to Tammy Cooper Garvin, and to Cristiano Eduardo for being here as our second panel today. And ask if you don't mind putting your contact information in the chat if you are open to people contacting you, that would be great. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lily Harvey, who's going to be leading us in our concluding activity.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I've just enjoyed being here with you all today. I'm Lily Harvey. I'm a directing attorney at Homebase, and I lead the work of the Criminal Legal System Initiative. We're in our 2.5 year of doing stuff, and we'll tell you a little bit more about how to learn more about what we do in a little bit, but just really want to echo all of the thanks and the thanks that's come through in the chat as well, to all of our panelists, to Andrea, our keynote speaker, and to all of you for your incredible participation in the chat, for bringing forth hard and important ideas. I just think the breadth of experience and perspective that we've heard here today is inspiring. And so on that note, we want to just take a few minutes at the end to think about where we go from here, right? To make sure that we aren't printing out some slides and, keeping them dusty in our archived inbox or wherever we keep such things after we go to events like these, but how we can really reflect and try to identify action that we can take based on what we've heard about today, things that many of you know very, very, very much about, and some of us are just learning about, but how we can all find a space and a way to engage with what we've heard today and to move that into change and to action and to ongoing engagement. And really hearkening back to Andrea's words at the beginning about what can we do with this information and how can we take it with us. So what we're going to be doing just briefly is we're going to ask folks to go ahead and again participate in the chat. If that doesn't work for you, when you want to hit the raise hand function, we'll try to do some of that too in the time we have left, and ask people to come off mute so we can sort of have folks take turns if that works better for people. But we're going to just ask you to fill in the blanks on a few sentences that'll hopefully give us a chance again to reflect and identify opportunities for further conversation and action. So hopefully it'll make sense as we go along. If you want to go ahead to the next slide. The first sentence, slide after that. The first sentence that we're going to ask folks to reflect on is to share in the chat one thing that you will take away from today's convening. So one thing I will take away from today's convening is blank. It can be a big thing or a little thing or a medium thing. So we'll go ahead and give you all a moment to reflect and then hopefully to share one thing that you will take away from today's convening in the chat. Seeing that thought shared by Cristiano Eduardo about curiosity and barriers and the barriers it can create being reflected back. Right. Definitely feeling that there's a lot of work to be done. Thanks, Tammy. All right. Right, definitely the call to think about how we have conversations and what we are doing to exacerbate harm versus respond and minimize harm, right, around re-traumatization, things like that. These are wonderful. Thank you. Please keep them going. We're going to go ahead and move on to the next question, but feel free to keep putting thoughts in the chat for this one as well. So based on that reflection and what you've learned here today, we'd like you to fill in this blank. Based on what I learned today, I plan to blank. And so this is the part, again, little, medium, big. Some way you can help move these reflections into action in your own communities, in your own personal or professional life, your organizations. Right, so a call for education. Definitely seeing that the call for a little bit more, compassion and that perspective. Being mindful about the assessments we may already be doing. Community resource list. I want one of those, yes. Calling back to the idea of language and the words that we use, I really appreciated that as well, that calling that out. And I think that's a conversation as a community to have ongoing, learn from each other about. Wonderful. Okay, and we'll go ahead and move to the third slide. This is our last question for you, and thank you everyone who's engaging in the chat. So with those reflections and actions in mind, please feel free to share thoughts on this one. I will hold myself accountable to take this action by blank. So what's something that you can leave here today with these ideas in mind and really make sure that you're holding yourself accountable to do something with them? Thank you for that. Wonderful. So it sounds like a lot of these kind of speak to the idea of reaching out to do ongoing education for yourself and your staff, or finding folks to continue to be in conversation with in the community. And I always find that accountability is easier for me when I have a partner to do it with. So I relate to that, and I appreciate those thoughts as well. Some commitments to looking at staff training as well. Wonderful. Thank you everyone for engaging in that activity. And certainly feel free to keep sharing ideas in the chat as we close out. Just again, wanted to thank you all for coming to this second annual convening of the Criminal Legal System Initiative at Homebase. We wanted to share with you, we do a newsletter where we send out typically 4 messages. Sometimes we do reminders for events a year with original resources and other partner system resources we create about the intersection between housing instability, houselessness, and the criminal legal system, and that cyclical relationship between those 3 experiences. So please feel free to sign up. You can use the QR code or that tiny URL there. And please feel free, we're so fortunate to have incredible presenters and panelists join us today, and they've been really generous with sharing out their contact information, and we really encourage you to use it. They gave it to you, they said it was okay. And same with us. We will be dropping in the chat a feedback form. It helps inform our next convening. And again, always really appreciate some thoughts have been shared already that we will take to heart. But on topics, ideas, formats, all of those things, we really appreciate you taking, I believe it's, yes, 3 questions, 30 seconds to share those thoughts with us. And thank you to the Homebase team, to Byla and to Mahir and Michelle, especially, and our colleague Nick, who joined us to make this possible, to keep all of the work going at Homebase around this really important intersectional topic. So thank you all. Again, sorry, the URL is up on the slide, and we will share that information out as well. We'll be sending, as I mentioned, a follow-up email that'll have the recording from today and slides and some other resources. We'll try to reflect some of the ideas shared in the chat back anonymously so you can think about them, and it can be part of your accountability plan and your action plan for what to do today and ongoing. And we'll also share out with everyone who registered a link to our report that we have coming out about promising practices in housing programs for people who are coming out of incarcerated institutions. And it features Home Free, we heard from Tammy, as well as many other really fantastic organizations who are doing great work. I know some folks from some of those programs were on a call today. So we're excited to share that out with you all first, and then take it from there. So do stay tuned. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime. We'll hang out for the next few minutes to let people share ideas and resources in the chat. But otherwise, really, again, wanted to appreciate and thank you all for making time and space in your comfortable or uncomfortable chairs, wherever you are, to be part of this conversation today, and for all of your engagement and wisdom that was shared. So thank you again.